Sandra had exactly 3 seconds to decide. 3 seconds before the tiny, dancing red dot settling over the heart of the most dangerous man in Seoul became a fatal bullet wound. She could scream a warning, but that would be too slow. She could drop her serving tray, run for the exit, and protect herself from the lethal crossfire of a world she didn't belong in. She chose a third option. Abandoning her tray to the floor with a shattering crash, she marched toward the stranger's table, praying her frantic scramble looked more like a passionate outburst than a desperate rescue. The man looked up the moment she stopped beside him. His eyes were obsidian and cold, the kind of piercing gaze that promised violence and made your thoughts scatter into panic. Sandra didn't let herself think. Before courage could fail her, she lunged forward, throwing her arms around his neck and crashing her lips against the edge of his mouth, dragging his torso down and out of the sniper's line of sight. The world seemed to freeze. At the next table, a woman in a sequined dress gasped, her jaw dropping in scandalized shock at the sight of a waitress accosting a VIP. But the man beneath Sandra didn't flinch. He didn't move an inch away from the gun resting on the table beside his glass of amber liquor. His expression remained terrifyingly controlled, unreadable, as if women threw themselves at him to stage a lover's quarrel every day of the week. Suddenly, the reality of what she had done slammed into her chest. She had just assaulted a Mafia boss. "Sniper," she whispered frantically against his jaw, her breath trembling. "There was a laser on your chest." For a second, he remained perfectly still, but instead of diving for cover or shouting for his guards, a dark, slow smirk curved his lips against her cheek. Amused, predatory. Sandra shuddered. What the hell? Then she felt it. The subtle, dangerous shift in his body. The muscles tightened beneath his tailored black suit, and his large hand slid up her waist, not roughly, but with an iron, inescapable grip that pinned her exactly where she was. Danger. This man was pure danger. The relaxed, calculating look in his eyes said it all. She had just saved his life, and now he was never going to let her leave. The transition from the opulent restaurant floor to the suffocating dark of the armored SUV happened in a dizzying blur. Sandra was practically thrown onto the plush leather seats, the heavy doors slamming shut behind her with a finality that made her stomach drop. Before she could even scramble upright, a shadow lunged across the cabin. Cold, tempered steel pressed flush against the frantic pulse at her throat. Lee-seom loomed over her, the amused smirk from the dining room completely gone. In the dim, passing streetlights, his eyes were ruthless, stripped of all pretense. The man holding her down wasn't a playboy VIP, he was an apex predator cornering a potential threat. "Who sent you?" His voice was a low, velvet rasp, practically vibrating in the confined space. He didn't yell. The quiet certainty in his tone was far more terrifying than a shout. Sandra's breath hitched, her hands trembling where they hovered uselessly above his wrists. "No one," she choked out, acutely aware of the blade resting dangerously close to her carotid artery. "I swear, You expect me to believe a banquet waitress spotted a suppressed laser sight across a crowded, dimly lit ballroom by coincidence? I was polishing the silver," she cried out, the sheer absurdity of her impending death cracking her composure. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, born of pure, unadulterated adrenaline and terror. "The tray caught the reflection. I saw the red dot moving up your lapel. I didn't want to watch someone die while I was serving champagne." He searched her face, his dark gaze cutting right through her. Every flinch, every panicked dilation of her pupils, every ragged breath was ruthlessly scrutinized. Lee-seom was a man who survived by reading the microscopic tells of liars, traitors, and assassins. Sandra had none of them. She was a messy, terrified civilian reeking of cheap restaurant soap and sheer panic. Slowly, the impossible tension in his jaw relaxed. The cold steel retreated from her neck, vanishing back into his jacket with a practiced, seamless motion. He leaned back into the shadows of the leather seat, the oppressive weight of his presence shifting from lethal to agonizingly calculating. He realized the terrifying truth. She wasn't a plant, she wasn't an assassin. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a hopelessly ordinary woman who had just inserted herself into a bloody underworld war out of a tragically misplaced sense of humanity, and by doing so publicly, pretending to be his lover in front of half the city's elite, she had unknowingly tethered her fate to his. "You shouldn't have interfered," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the faint red mark the dull side of his blade had left on her throat. The darkness in his eyes shifted, settling into something far heavier than suspicion. A smart woman would have just looked away. The silence in the SUV was suddenly shattered by the insistent buzzing of a phone. Lee-seom didn't look away from Sandra as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek device. He glanced at the screen for only a second before his eyes narrowed, a cold, calculating light returning to them. "It's already everywhere," he murmured, turning the screen toward her. Sandra's heart did a slow, painful roll. There, in a grainy, high-contrast photo taken by a witness, she was draped over him, her face partially obscured as she lunged toward the most feared man in the city. The headline beneath it was written in bold, sensationalist script, "The Secret Queen of Baeko?" "The world thinks I have a weakness," Lee-seom said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "They think I've been hiding a lover in plain sight. My enemies are already salivating at the chance to use you against me. And the traitor in my ranks, he's wondering how he missed you." Sandra shook her head, her voice barely a breath. "Then tell them the truth. Tell them I'm nobody. Just let me go back to my life." "Your life ended the moment you touched me," he countered, his gaze sweeping over her cheap, stained waitress uniform. "If I cast you out now, you're a dead woman walking. They'll kidnap you, torture you for my secrets, and when they realize you have none, they'll discard you like trash." The raw brutality of his words made her flinch. She thought of her sister, Boonboo, waiting for the next wire transfer for her tuition. If Sandra disappeared, if she died in some gutter in Seoul, what would happen to her? Lee-seom leaned closer, the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold rain clinging to him. "But there is a second option. We lean into the lie. You play the part of my devoted, mysterious lover. You stand by my side until I find the rat who tried to put a bullet in my heart tonight." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, gold-embossed card. "I will pay you enough to never work another double shift in your life, enough to send your sister to any university in the world, a king's ransom for a few weeks of theater." Sandra looked from the card to his obsidian eyes. The choice was an illusion. The contract of silence was a gilded cage, but it was the only one that offered a way out of the line of fire. "And when it's over?" she whispered. "When it's over," he said, his hand lingering near her waist, "you walk away with your pockets full and your life intact. But until then, Sandra, you belong to the act." The car slowed as it turned into a private, high-security estate. The performance had officially begun. The transformation was clinical and ruthless. Within an hour of arriving at the estate, the cheap polyester of Sandra's waitress uniform, stained with spilled gin and the sweat of a double shift, was whisked away, replaced by the cool, suffocating touch of midnight silk. A team of silent women moved with surgical precision, painting her skin with shimmering oils and cinching her into a gown that fit like a second skin. Finally, the diamonds were brought in, a heavy, glittering collar that felt less like jewelry and more like a mark of ownership. When Lee-seom stepped into the dressing room, the air seemed to thin. He didn't speak immediately. He walked a slow circle around her, his obsidian eyes tracing the line of her throat where his blade had rested only hours before. Now that same skin was veiled in millions of dollars of ice. "Look at me," he commanded. Sandra met his gaze in the mirror. She looked like a stranger, regal, untouchable, and utterly terrified. He reached out, his thumb grazing the corner of her jaw. a touch that was both a threat and a promise. From this moment, you don't flinch. You don't apologize. You are the only person in this city I care about. If you break character, we both bleed. He led her down a marble corridor toward a set of heavy mahogany doors. Behind these doors are the vultures, he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. My lieutenants. They have spent their lives looking for a crack in my armor. Tonight, they think they found one. The doors swung open. The room was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and old fermented grudges. 3 men sat around a low table, their eyes sharp and predatory. They didn't stand when Lee-seom entered. Instead, they watched Sandra with a hunger that had nothing to do with desire. These were men who lived by the blade, and they were searching for the lie in her eyes. So this is her, he rasped, his gaze traveling slowly from her heels to her diamonds. The one who made the great Lee-seom forget his own security protocols? Sandra felt her knees tremble, but she remembered the weight of the contract. She didn't look away. Instead, she leaned into Lee-seom, feeling the solid, dangerous heat of him. He draped an arm possessively around her waist, his fingers digging slightly into the silk of her dress in a display of territorial power. Careful, Young-ho, he said, his voice dropping to a lethally calm register. You're looking at her like she's a problem to be solved. Look at her again and remember she's the woman who saved my life. Treat her accordingly. The room stayed silent, the air vibrating with the unspoken challenge. The vultures didn't believe the lie, not yet, but as Sandra felt the iron grip of Lee-seom's hand against her hip, she realized the act was no longer just a performance. It was a war of nerves, and she was the prize. The music at the Syndicate Gala was a low, thrumming pulse designed to mask the whispers of men bartering lives for territory. Sandra felt the weight of 1,000 eyes as Lee-seom led her toward the center of the dance floor. His hand was a warm, heavy anchor against the small of her back, steering her with a grace that felt entirely too natural. "Smile, Sandra," he murmured, his lips brushing her temple in a gesture that looked like a secret endearment to the room, but felt like a command to her. "You're supposed to be the woman who tamed the white tiger, not a lamb waiting for the slaughter." "I'm trying," she whispered back, her fingers digging into the expensive wool of his blazer. "But the tiger is currently holding me captive." Their rhythm was interrupted by a man who moved like a snake in a silk suit. Boss Han, a rival whose smile never reached his hooded reptilian eyes, stepped into their space. He didn't wait for an invitation, his gaze raking over Sandra with a terrifying intensity. "Lee-seom, you've been hiding a treasure," Han said, his voice a gravelly rasp. He turned his focus to Sandra, a predatory glint in his eye. "Tell me, my dear, since you've clearly seen him at his most intimate, does he still have that jagged mark on his ribs, the one from the pier in Busan? He used to say it was the only thing his father ever truly gave him." The air between them turned to ice. Sandra felt Lee-seom's grip tighten, a silent warning. She didn't know about a mark on his ribs. She didn't know about Busan. One wrong word and the facade the vultures watching from the balconies would see it shatter like cheap glass. Sandra didn't blink. She had spent years reading the subtle cues of difficult customers in high-end lounges. She knew a trap when she heard one. She let a slow, knowing smile spread across her lips, the kind of look a woman gives when she's seen a man's soul and isn't impressed by his scars. She stepped closer to Han, her voice dropping to a confidential, silk-edged purr. "Lee-seom doesn't waste time talking about his father's gifts. He's much more interested in the marks he leaves on others. But if you're so curious about his history, perhaps you should ask yourself why he hasn't let me out of his sight since the night I proved I could see things his own security missed." She felt Lee-seom's surprise, a momentary hitch in his breath, before he smoothed it over with a low, dark chuckle. "She has a sharp tongue, Han, and a sharper eye. I'd suggest you stop looking for old wounds and worry about the ones you are currently inviting." Han's smile faltered. He bowed his head slightly, the predator recognizing a trap he hadn't expected. As they whirled back into the dance, Sandra felt the frantic thud of her heart against her ribs. She had survived the first test, but the heat in Lee-seom's gaze as he looked down at her wasn't just part of the act anymore. It was something far more dangerous. The air in the private study was thick with a metallic tang of blood and the sharp sting of antiseptic. Gone was the invincible king of the syndicate. In his place sat a man with his jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to shatter. He had been grazed during the chaotic exit from the gala, a silent, high-velocity reminder that the shadows were closing in. Sandra's hands trembled as she dipped a cotton swab into the alcohol. "You should have let your medics handle this," she whispered, her voice sounding small in the vast, cavernous room. "I don't trust anyone with my skin tonight," Lee-seom rasped. He had shed his jacket and shirt, his torso a map of old violence. "Only you. You're the only one who has no reason to want me dead yet." As she pressed the swab to the jagged tear on his shoulder, his breath hitched, a sharp, visceral sound that made her heart hammer against her ribs. She moved closer, her knees brushing his, her focus narrowing to the task. She looked for the mark Boss Han had mentioned, the gift from his father. It was there, a faint, twisted silver line near his 8th rib. It hadn't been a lie. It had been a test of her intimacy. "It's deep," she murmured, her thumb unintentionally grazing the warmth of his collarbone. She expected him to pull away, to bark a command, or to re-establish the distance. Instead, Lee-seom leaned his forehead against her shoulder, his weight suddenly, staggeringly real. The white tiger was gone. For a heartbeat, he was just a man who had been fighting a war alone since he was a boy. "Everyone wants the crown. No one wants the head that wears it. It's heavy, Sandra." The vulnerability in his tone was more dangerous than the sniper's laser. It was a hook that sank deep into her chest, pulling her toward him. She realized then that the contract wasn't just for her safety, it was for his sanity. He wasn't just keeping her close to maintain an act, he was keeping her close because she was the only thing in his world that wasn't a weapon. She reached out, her fingers ghosting over his dark hair in a gesture of comfort that wasn't in the script. He didn't move. He didn't stop her. The ice hadn't just cracked, it was beginning to melt, and Sandra knew that when it finally shattered, neither of them would survive the flood. The sanctuary of the estate felt like a tomb at the moment Sandra's old burner phone buzzed in her silk pocket. It was a single image. Boonmi, sitting at her usual library table in Mapo-gu, unaware of the man in the background wearing a distinct, jagged fang tattoo on his wrist. The air left Sandra's lungs. The iron fangs hadn't just found a weakness, they had found her soul. Her first instinct was the one that had kept her alive in the slums: run. She didn't think about the contract, the diamonds, or the man whose vulnerability she had held in her hands only hours before. She stripped off her heels, grabbing a dark trench coat to cover her evening gown, and sprinted toward the service entrance. She had to get to Boonmi. She had to pay whatever debt they claimed she owed before they realized Boonmi was the sister of a waitress, not a mafia queen. "Where are you going, Sandra?" The voice was like a gunshot. She froze at the edge of the courtyard, the heavy iron gates just yards away. Young-ho, the most suspicious of the vultures, stepped out from the shadow of a stone pillar. His eyes were narrow, tracking her frantic breathing and the way she clutched her old, battered phone like a lifeline. I needed air," she stammered, her reginal mask slipping. Her voice was too high, too desperate. "In the rain, without your security detail." Gyong-ho stepped closer, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife at his belt. "You look like a woman planning a betrayal, or perhaps a woman who was never who she claimed to be." Sandra's heart hammered against her ribs. She was seconds away from screaming the truth, that she was just a girl from the South Side trying to save her sister. The act was a thin veil, and Gyong-ho was holding the shears. "She's going exactly where I told her to go." Lee-seom appeared at the top of the marble stairs, his silhouette imposing against the light of the foyer. He descended slowly, his gaze locked on Kyung-ho with a promise of absolute ruin. When he reached Sandra, he didn't demand an explanation. He simply wrapped a heavy arm around her shivering body, flush against his heat. "My woman doesn't answer to you, Kyung-ho," Lee-seom said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "And if you ever corner her in the dark again, I'll make sure you never see the light." Kyung-ho bowed, his expression a mask of frustrated submission, and retreated. But as soon as he was gone, Lee-seom's grip changed. He spun Sandra around, his eyes burning with a terrifying mix of fury and something that looked dangerously like fear. He took the burner phone from her trembling hand, looking at the photo of Boonmi. "You tried to handle the fangs alone," he rasped, his thumb pressing into the small of her back. "She's not a ghost, she's my sister," Sandra cried, the waitress finally eclipsing the queen. Lee-seom leaned in, his face inches from hers. "In this world, she's a target. And if you ever try to leave this house without me again, I won't just lock the gates. I'll make sure there's no world left for you to run to." The air in the private lounge was thick with the scent of lilies and gunpowder. It was a celebration that felt more like a funeral. Sandra stood at Lee-seom's side, her hand resting on his arm, her fingers grazing the expensive fabric of his suit. The diamond ring on her finger felt like a lead weight, a sparkling lie designed to draw the predator out of the tall grass. "You look perfect," Lee-seom murmured, his voice low and intimate for the benefit of the hidden cameras and the sharp-eyed men in the room. He leaned down, his lips ghosting over her ear. "The moment I make the announcement, the rat will panic. Stay behind me. Do not move no matter what you hear." Sandra nodded, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked across the room at Ji-hoon, the man who had been at Lee-seom's right hand since the beginning. He was the one who had handled the makeover, the one who had coordinated the security, the one Lee-seom trusted more than his own shadow. Ji-hoon caught her eye and gave a small, reassuring nod. Lee-seom raised his glass, the amber liquid catching the light. "I've spent my life building walls," he said, his voice carrying with a terrifying, calm authority. "But tonight, I'm building a bridge to Sandra, my future wife, and the new era of the syndicate." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. The vultures exchanged looks of disbelief and calculation. This was the moment. The trap was sprung. But the strike didn't come from the door, and it didn't come from the rival bosses. The lights didn't just flicker, they died. In the sudden, oppressive darkness, the sound of a suppressed gunshot hissed through the air. Sandra felt herself being shoved violently to the floor, the cold marble biting into her knees. "Lee-seom!" she screamed. A secondary emergency light kicked in, casting the room in a ghoulish, strobing red. Lee-seom was standing, a crimson stain spreading across his white dress shirt, but his eyes weren't on his wound. They were fixed on the man holding the smoking gun. Ji-hoon didn't look like a traitor. He looked like a man finishing a chore. "Why?" Lee-seom's voice was a jagged whisper, the first time she'd heard it break. "You became soft, Lee-seom," Ji-hoon said, his face a mask of cold efficiency. "You let a waitress into the inner sanctum. You gave them a target. I'm not killing you for power. I'm killing you to save what's left of us." The betrayal was a physical blow, more devastating than the bullet. As the syndicate guards scrambled and the room dissolved into a bloodbath, Sandra realized the act hadn't just lured out the enemy, it had burned down the only foundation Lee-seom had left. He was no longer a king, he was a target, and the man who knew all his secrets was the one holding the crosshairs. The smell of salt and rotting wood was the only warning before the van doors flew open, spilling Sandra into the damp chill of a riverside warehouse.
The chaos of the gala was miles away, but the screams and the staccato of gunfire still echoed in her skull. She had been snatched in the frenzy after the lights went out, separated from Lee-seom by a wall of smoke and Ji-hoon's calculated betrayal. "Where is he?" a voice snarled. It was one of Ji-hoon's men, his silhouette blocky and menacing against the moonlight filtering through the cracked skylights. "Where is the backup drive he keeps at the estate?" Sandra backed away, her heels catching on the uneven floorboards. She felt the heavy weight of the midnight silk gown, now torn and stained, dragging her down. Her hand drifted to the small of her back, where her fingers brushed against the cold, textured grip of the compact pistol Lee-seom had tucked into her waistband before they left the house. "If we are parted," he had whispered, "do not wait for a hero. Be the ghost." "I'm just a waitress," Sandra gasped, her voice trembling, though her fingers were finding their rhythm. She wasn't lying, but she was no longer the woman who dropped the tray. "I don't know about any drives." The man stepped into a patch of red light, the fang tattoo on his wrist gleaming. He raised a heavy hand to strike her. Sandra didn't flinch this time. She didn't scream. She remembered the way Lee-seom's thumb had traced her jaw, the quiet focus of a man who lived on the edge of a blade. She dropped to her knees, making herself look small, and as he lunged forward, she whipped the weapon from its hiding place. The roar of the gun in the enclosed space was deafening. The man crumpled, a look of pure shock frozen on his face. Sandra didn't stay to watch him fall. She scrambled behind a stack of rusted shipping crates, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. She could hear the others, 2, maybe 3 men, shouting to each other in the dark. "She's armed," one yelled. "Find her!" She moved like a shadow, her bare feet silent on the concrete. She bypassed the main exit, knowing they'd be watching it. Instead, she climbed a stack of wooden pallets, her breath hitching as she reached the rusted iron catwalk. From above, she saw them, 3 men moving in a tactical sweep. She wasn't a soldier, but she knew how to survive. She reached for a heavy metal chain hanging from a crane hook, swinging it with all her might. It crashed into a stack of empty barrels, the clatter drawing the men toward the far corner of the room. As they turned their backs, the warehouse doors didn't just open, they exploded. A silhouette stood in the center of the debris, framed by the cold soul mist. Lee-seom didn't look like a man who had been shot. He looked like an avenging god, his white shirt soaked in blood that wasn't all his own. He didn't call for his men. He didn't look for the traitors. His eyes scanned the shadows of the rafters until they locked onto hers. "Sandra!" he called, his voice a jagged, desperate command. She didn't wait. She leapt from the catwalk into the darkness, knowing he would be the only thing there to catch her.
The silence that followed the war was heavier than the gunfire. Within the reinforced walls of Lee-seom's private study, the distant sirens of Seoul felt like a dream from another life. The traitors had been purged, and the vultures had scattered into the shadows, leaving behind a kingdom that was scarred but still standing. Sandra stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, still wearing the tattered remains of the midnight silk. In her hand, she clutched a thick, cream-colored envelope, the weight of her sister's future, her ticket back to a world of double shifts and quiet nights. The debt was paid. The contract was fulfilled. "The car is waiting," Lee-seom said from behind her. He had changed into a fresh black shirt, the bandages beneath the fabric barely visible. He looked once more like the untouchable head of the Baekho syndicate, but the coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a weary, haunting intensity. "The funds have been transferred. You and your sister can go anywhere. You'll be protected, but you'll be free." Sandra turned, the envelope crinkling in her grip. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice caught between relief and a sudden sharp ache she hadn't expected. She walked toward the door, her bare feet silent on the silk rug. This was the end of the script. The waitress was leaving the stage. She reached for the handle, but before she could turn it, she heard the heavy metallic click of the electronic lock. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She turned back to find Lee-seom standing inches away, his shadow swallowing her whole.
He didn't look like a man letting go. He looked like a man who had finally realized what he was losing. "I told you you were free to go," he rasped, his hand resting on the doorframe just above her head. "I told myself the same thing, that once the traitor was dead and the threat was gone, I could let the act die." He stepped closer, the scent of sandalwood and danger enveloping her. His fingers reached out, ghosting over the pulse at her neck, the same spot where his knife had once drawn blood and where her diamonds had recently rested. "The lie was easier to handle than the truth," he admitted, his voice dropping to a raw, jagged confession. "I spent weeks pretending you were the only thing that mattered to me so that my enemies would believe it. Now they're gone, and I still can't breathe when you move toward the door." Sandra looked up at him, the pretend version of them shattering in the heat of his gaze. "Lee-seom, we had a deal." "The deal is over," he murmured, his hand sliding into her hair to tilt her face up to his. The obsidian ice in his eyes had finally melted into a dark, consuming fire. "I don't want the actress, Sandra, and I don't want the act, but I'm realizing I can't let the reality of you leave this room." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, the locked door behind her no longer a barrier, but a shield. The performance had ended, but for the first time, the danger to her heart was real.
What a journey! From a tray of spilled drinks in a soul ballroom to a locked room where the truth is finally more dangerous than the lie. Sandra and Lee-seom's story is only just beginning. If you want to see how this high-stakes game of shadows and silk unfolds, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Every like and comment helps us keep the cameras rolling on these stories. Until next time, stay sharp and watch your back. See you in the next one.